Welcome to FENA seminar, everybody. Today we have a speaker. Our speaker is Steve Lade, who's my colleague, and it is my pleasure to introduce him. Steve is currently a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University, and he's also a research scientist at the Earth Commission, where we are working together on trying to translate in the global level or the planetary level target into cities and businesses. And he's also an affiliate at FENA School. And Steve has recently landed an ARC Future Fellowship to develop model-based tools for building the resilience of water resource system in Australia. So he'll be joining us a bit more from next year. So Steve's work has been using the tools from complex system science and applied that to diverse problems in sustainability, resilience, and socio-ecological systems. And he has worked on diverse systems, including Earth system science, including the global carbon cycle, fisheries in the Baltic Sea, and poultry traps in developing world agriculture. And recently we've started working together, trying to explore some of this complex system science modeling, apply that to urban systems. So the floor is yours, Steve.
Thank you very much, Jumaid, for that introduction. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing right now, which is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I pay my respects to them. And also thank you very much to everyone for turning up, both physically, there's a few people here, and also online as well, and for tearing yourself away from the other important news of this week. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work that I'm doing through the Stockholm Resilience Center, my affiliation there. Towards the end, I'll get up onto a little bit of the work that I'm doing with Jumaid at the Earth Commission. And unfortunately, I won't quite have time to talk about what my future fellowship next year is going to be about. I'll have to save that for another talk. So today we're going to be dealing with the Earth system. We all us humans rely on a well-functioning Earth system to thrive and to survive. The Earth system is this complex system of components in the atmosphere, water on land, life on land and in the ocean, and the complex interactions of all these components that give rise to the planet that we have today. One popular way to map out the critical ways in which humans are disrupting the Earth system is the planetary boundaries framework. So this framework, which is over 10 years old now, maps out 9 key ways in which humans are interfering in the Earth system. At the global scale, it puts some numbers on the safe levels to which we can interfere in the Earth system and puts a rough number on how we're doing relative to those boundaries. And you can see the different issues mapped out there. Biosphere integrity, which is quite close to biodiversity, climate change, land system change, freshwater use, all the big global sustainability issues are there in this framework. Just a note on terminology, I'm going to be switching a little bit between guardrail and planetary boundary terminologies for reasons that I'll explain later, but for this talk, just keep those as basically interchangeable. And also about 6 months to a year ago, I had a paper come out which starts to map the interactions between the planetary boundaries, to map and quantify them. So obviously climate change and biodiversity loss are not independent. Climate change will accelerate biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss will in many cases reduce carbon storage in ecosystems and thereby accelerate climate change as well. So that means if you are reducing biodiversity, that means the safe amount of carbon that can be emitted reduces. So these limits interact. in this paper, we mapped out those interactions at the global scale and started to examine how those interactions start to shrink the safe operating space that we have as humans in the Earth system. So, for example, in this diagram on the right, the dashed line shows the safe operating space before you take interactions into account, and you can see that we can do less agriculture and emit less carbon once you recognise that these things interact, as shown by the solid green shape. So this is useful to start to map out how these things interact at the global scale. But one motivation for this study was to start to look at these interactions at the subglobal scale. We need a subglobal analysis to better deal with the pressures that humans apply and also their impacts, which are in specific places. And the significance of those pressures and impacts can be very different. So, for example, deforestation, a fixed amount of deforestation in Siberian wilderness might not have quite the same effect on the Earth system as deforestation in the Amazon, for example. The second research gap that we're trying to address in this study is the need for improved environmental metrics for actors such as in business, finance, and so on. A lot of these initiatives so far, most of them have been centered on climate and on emissions reduction. They're starting to look into some of the other issues, but it's still quite limited to climate, which is important, but we know that sustainability is about more than just climate. Except for the 1.5 degree target in climate, these metrics usually don't account for how much is too much. So if a company, say, decides to reduce its water extraction by a certain amount or its deforestation by a certain amount, how much is actually enough? It also doesn't account for Earth system interactions, and I'll show you later on how important they can be. And they often also don't account for the current levels of impact on that component of the Earth system. So, brief outline of what I'm going to be talking to you about today. First of all, to address the first of those research gaps, I'm going to talk to you about how we've been estimating interactions within the Earth system at the subglobal scale using a dynamic global vegetation model called LPJmL. Then, to address the second research gap that I introduced, we use these estimates of interaction strengths to construct a simple feedback model. Using that feedback model, we were able to estimate some amplification factors, which I'll define in due course, and then build that into a prototype metric for impacts on the Earth system. At the end of all that, I'll also describe a little bit of the related work that Jumei and I and others are doing with the Earth Commission. Just a note that all these results are still preliminary. We're still finalising everything, and they're also unpublished. So please don't circulate any of these results, and also feedback is very much welcome as we work towards finalising the paper. And just in terms of the scope of this presentation, I'm going to be talking mainly about the modelling that we've done and the logic behind that and the results that it leads to. The interactions with or the involved engagement with financial actors and so on is something that's going to come later in the project, and we're not quite at that stage yet. And just to introduce the people who are involved in this project is led by Beatrice Kroner in the upper right corner of the screen. She's the leader of the Global Economic Dynamics and the Biosphere program at the Royal Swedish Academy of Science. And this project is funded through that research program from the Swedish Innovations Agency, which is called Vinnova. And she has the deep background knowledge on the financial sector and how Earth system impacts affect the financial sector. Ingo Fetzer in the bottom right is a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. He has the expertise on the LPJ model that we're using. I've contributed the expertise on Earth system interactions and the feedback modelling, and then Sarah Cornell in the bottom left, her expertise spans across all those three areas. So before I get into the details of the models themselves, I'm going to introduce 5 design criteria that we had in mind when we were doing this study. So these are the things that we're trying to deliver on in the interactions analysis and in our prototyping impact metric. The first one I've already motivated for you, that we want to account for Earth system components beyond climate. The 3 we've chosen beyond climate as measured by atmospheric CO2 concentration are land as measured by vegetation area of different vegetation types in different regions around the world, and also water as measured by surface water runoff. We chose those 3 because Earth system literature shows that the climate and the biosphere are the 2 core components of the Earth system with which all other things interact and rely on. We've chosen the land and water as proxies for the state of the biosphere. We're not trying to measure the state of the biosphere directly for now, but just using land and water as proxies for that state. And also when it comes to the engagement with actors, carbon emissions, deforestation and water extraction are pressures that they commonly measure. As I mentioned before, we're doing a subglobal analysis. So the scale of the subglobal analysis that we are doing is that we're distinguishing pressures and impacts on land and water by region and by vegetation type. So this is an output from the model LPJ, which I'll introduce shortly, which shows the estimated vegetation cover of different types before human interference across the world. So this is basically the map that we're going to use to break apart the world into blocks. So we're going to look at pressures and impacts across, for example, all boreal forest in North America, or tropical forest in Africa, etc., etc. The third thing is that we're going to account for interactions between Earth system components, as I've already motivated. Specifically, we're going to look at 4 interactions. We're going to look at the effect of climate change on water runoff through changed rainfall distributions, the effect of climate change on vegetation cover through mechanisms such as altered rainfall and temperature distributions, and also changed CO2 concentration. We're going to look at the effect of land cover change on water runoff. One of the well-known mechanisms there is that deforestation leads to changed amounts of soil penetration and vegetation transpiration, and then also the effect of land cover change on climate through release of carbon. One side note is that we're going to be doing a linear analysis of these interactions, which means we're going to be looking mainly at interactions inside the guardrail. So we're going to be looking at how these interactions push us closer to the critical thresholds in the Earth system, that push us closer to that edge and accelerate us towards the edge. In this analysis, we're not going to be looking at what happens beyond that edge. So for example, the cascading of tipping points that have been discussed a lot in the literature recently. That would be a very interesting thing to do, but not in this. It's beyond the scope of this particular paper. As I've also motivated already, we're also going to be assessing the current state of the Earth system relative to guardrails. For those guardrails, we are going to take the regional planetary boundaries that were proposed by Stefan et al. In the 2015 version of the Planetary Boundary Framework. Those guardrails are, well, for climate at the global scale, 350 ppm, which we're obviously well beyond now. For land, it gives a guardrail of 15% loss of boreal and tropical forest and 50% loss of temperate forest. That is the guardrail that the Planetary Boundary Framework places on those processes. It's important to keep in mind that the actual tipping point, or the actual point at which the degradation of Earth system function becomes critical, might be somewhere beyond that guardrail. This guardrail is a safe is put at hopefully a safe place before that degradation happens. And the fifth factor that we're going to take into account, and the importance of this will become obvious later, is that we're also going to account for the total availability of the resource in that particular domain. So for example, water extraction and a fixed amount of water extraction will undoubtedly have more impact if you're extracting water from the Sahara Desert compared to extracting from the Amazon rainforest. And likewise, land clearing will likely have more impact in Australian alpine forest than in Asian boreal forest, just because of the sheer amount of forest that's already there. So the Dynamic Global Vegetation Model, LPJmL. LPJmL stands for Lund Potsdam Jena Managed Land. This is a spatially explicit model. It splits the world up into, in the version we were using, half-degree by half-degree cells. In each of those cells, it models, well, the part of the model that we were interested in is that it models 13 different plant functional types in each of those cells. It also models crop functional types. It has components which model the growth of each of those plant functional types, but also hydrological components, representation of the different soil characteristics in the different regions, the effects of land use, and so on and so forth. For this model, what we did is we aggregated those 13 plant functional types into 5 categories: tropical forest, temperate forest, boreal forest, and C3 and C4 grasslands, which are cold climate and warm climate grasslands. So the first step, estimating the interaction strengths within the Earth system. The basic approach that we took here was to basically hold one thing constant and then change the other thing to see what the effect of that other thing is. So in the first instance, to look at the effect of vegetation cover on water and carbon, we held climate change constant in the model, and then did 2 different LPJ runs, one where we had human land use change as the model's best guess, and also one simulation run where we assumed no human land use change. And then looked at the difference in runoff and vegetation carbon between those 2 scenarios. So in this top graph, in this top map, you can see how runoff changes between those 2 scenarios. In some parts of the world, there is quite significantly more runoff after land use change is accounted for than before. But also in most parts of the world, there will be less vegetation carbon, obviously, once you take land use change into account compared to before. And then the interaction strength in these different regions is just for example, the effect of land use change on water is, we just calculate that as the change in surface water flow averaged over that region divided by the change in vegetation area of that region. And similarly for the effect of land on climate. And then similarly, when we try to estimate the effect of climate on water and vegetation cover, we hold human land use change fixed to 0, so we don't allow that to vary, and instead allow climate to vary. And for example, for the effect of climate on vegetation area, we end up with this scatter of points, which we then did a linear regression on. I'm about to show you some results. Before I do that, I'm just going to introduce this normalization that we did on all our results. We normalized all our state variables. So obviously land, climate, and water are measured in different units to allow us to intercompare these things more readily. We normalized all those things using this formula so that a normalized value of 0 corresponds to its pre-industrial levels, and a normalized value of 1 corresponds to that variable being at its guardrail. And then similarly, we also defined a normalized interaction strength. a normalized interaction strength of 1 would mean that one Earth system state variable X changing from pre-industrial to its planetary boundary would then cause another Earth system state variable Y to change from pre-industrial to its planetary boundary. So these are results for interaction strengths. If I take the couple on the bottom first, these are pretty much as expected. It's obvious that removing vegetation cover will lead to, so that's increased impact on land cover will lead to increased impact on climate because of the carbon released by that vegetation. And you can see that all these interaction strengths are positive in the different regions representing that relationship. We also found that in almost all of these regions, according to LPJ, removal of vegetation will also lead to decreased impact on water flows. So this represents the common knowledge that removing forest will generally lead to more runoff. I should add that here we're only looking at the effects on mean runoff, climate change, and also vegetation removal might lead to increased variance in water runoff, which is probably not a good thing, but that is beyond the scope of our metric. For the effect of climate on runoff and vegetation cover, it's a lot more regionally variable, which is, as you would expect, global climate change has very different impacts in terms of temperature and precipitation in different areas of the world. So it's quite reasonable that these are mixed in their sign. So our next step, having these interaction strengths, was to build these interaction strengths into a feedback model. So without interactions, the basic picture that we have is that a pressure on the Earth system leads then to some change in the state of the Earth system. Once we take interactions into account, this feedback leads to an additional pressure on another component of the Earth system, and you end up potentially with this feedback loop. We took a very simple approach to analysing the effects of these feedbacks. We wrote down this equation saying that at equilibrium, the state X will be the initial pressure, D, plus the effect of these feedbacks, B times X. Once you rearrange this equation for X, that equation is actually wrong. I'm sorry about that. I'll have to fix that. This should read X equals 1, the inverse of 1 minus B times D. But the end result is that we get an equation that expresses the final state as a result of these initial pressures, amplified by these feedbacks. So this is a linear and an equilibrium approach. It is definitely possible to extend this method to take into account non-linearities and transient dynamics, but you would need then data to parameterize those non-linearities and those transients. So the first thing that we investigated as a result of these feedbacks was the amplification factor. So we've defined that here as the magnitude of the change in the states divided by the magnitude of the change in the initial pressures. So that means if there are no interactions in the Earth system, the change in state is equal to the change in pressure, and the amplification factor will be 1. If we have an amplification factor that's greater than 1, then interactions are amplifying the impacts on the Earth system. Less than 1 means it's partially mitigating. And these are our results over here. You can see that the biggest amplification factor is for tropical South American forest. That actually didn't colour in properly. That 3.5 is the biggest of our results. And that's highlighting the key role that the Amazon rainforest has in the Earth system. For example, in terms of the very large amounts of carbon that are stored there. We also had large amplification factors in other temperate and tropical forests, also in boreal forests. Grasslands had their metrics closer to 1. You can see the amplification factor for carbon emissions was actually a little bit less than 1. This is because of the effects that I showed in our analysis before, where, for example, increased climate change can lead to increased surface water runoff, which our model counts as generally a good thing. However, the amplification factor is not negative, so the net effect of carbon emissions is still to have an impact. It's just that this is, in our interactions analysis, partially mitigated by impacts, by the cascading effects on other parts of the Earth system. To construct, now I'm going to move from the amplification factor, which was our basis for constructing the prototype impact metric, but we needed to incorporate a couple of final ingredients in order to get to that metric. The first one is that, as I said before, we wanted to account for the current state of the Earth system relative to those guardrails. So we used LPJ, we went back to LPJ to try to assess the components, the current state of each of these Earth system components relative to these guardrails. So you can see the assessment for climate is at 1.5, it's beyond its planetary boundary of 350 ppm. For land, many parts are well beyond their planetary boundary thresholds as well. For example, boreal forest in Europe, tropical forest in North America, which includes Central America. The current state of the Earth system at this level of analysis for water has some parts of the world very close to their guardrails, for example, grasslands in North America. There's a handful of regions which in this analysis have had slight increases in runoff since pre-industrial times, and those are the areas with negative numbers here. And the other twist that we put on the amplification factor to get the impact metric is that we're accounting for total availability of that particular resource, which basically means we implemented this by not weighting by the initial pressure, just the total change in state. So now these are our results. Well, first of all, here is the metric that we defined. We're now basically just weighting the impacts on different parts of the Earth system by the current state, where X now is the current state. We use this particular weighting function. And these are our results on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can see, for example, in the particular metric that we've defined here, a fixed area, we used 1 square kilometre as an example of removal of vegetation, would have biggest impact in Australian tropical forest in this particular metric. That's because the area of Australian tropical forest is already quite small compared to all these other different vegetation types. So some of the ways that we could use this is, for example, a comparison across different regions, across different vegetation types in the same region. So you can see, for example, that if you had to remove a square kilometre of vegetation in South America, the biggest impact would be on if you did that deforestation on tropical South American rainforest, but the other 3 are all very close behind. And these are our results down here. For water withdrawal, you can see that because it's already very water scarce, additional water withdrawals in North American grasslands will have quite a significant impact, but also in a number of other regions in the world as well. So how do we propose to use this Earth system impact metric? First of all, actors such as businesses or financial investors or cities could use this to, first of all, measure their current impact on the Earth system. And then once they've measured it, they could try to manage their future impacts. For example, they could use this metric to underlie their prioritization of where they're going to reduce their impacts in the future, and also set targets for how to reduce that impact. I should emphasize also that we would envision this sort of metric to be embedded in a framework such as the mitigation hierarchy to avoid unintended consequences. So the mitigation hierarchy, one version of it says that you should first of all aim to avoid any impacts. If you can't avoid, you should then reduce any impacts you already have. If you can't do that, you should then try to restore, for example, ecosystems in response to impacts that you've already had. And only as a last resort, if you can't do any of those initial three, should you try to offset your impacts in one place by positive impacts elsewhere. Should also emphasize that this analysis is at the Earth system scale, and it doesn't replace environmental impact assessments of more local scale issues. So for example, a specific species which is critically endangered in a specific region, that sort of concern is not captured in this type of analysis. So it should be complementary to those sorts of assessments. So just to summarize what we've done there in producing that impact metric, we basically had two methods. We had this dynamic global vegetation model, LPJ. We did different model runs, for example, switching land use change on and off to get interaction strengths, which we then turned into amplification factors. We also used LPJ to get the current state of the Earth system, and we fed all those things together into this prototype impact metric. Some areas for future work, some of the very obvious ones, we're only in this analysis covering climate, land and water, as highlighted by the Planetary Boundaries Framework. There are many other issues in the Earth system that we should be worried about. And then even in terms of climate, land and water, we've only looked at carbon dioxide concentrations, vegetation cover and surface water flow. There's obviously, just to take water as an example, there's many other aspects of the water cycle, for example, groundwater, that we should be worried about. We only assess those four interactions that I described at the start. There are other interactions between those components that we should be concerned about as well. As I mentioned, this analysis only looked at the means, not variance. It only looked at equilibrium and a linear analysis. And also it was at a regional scale, not going all the way down to, say, a catchment level or a particular biome scale that might be more useful for some types of management. So that's all I wanted to say about our impact metric. Now, just for your interest, I'm going to briefly go through this initiative called the Earth Commission, which both Jermaine and I are involved in. So this is a body. It's about 1 year old now, so it's quite new. It's led by these co-chairs, Joeta Gupta, Dahe Kin, and Johan Rockström, and it's hosted by the Swedish Hub of Future Earth. There are the Earth Commissioners. The Earth Commission is made up of 19 natural and social scientists from around the world. You can see that Jermaine is one of those Earth Commissioners. My role is in the Secretariat supporting the Earth Commission. The objective of the Earth Commission is to conduct an independent scientific assessment to define what we're currently calling a safe and just corridor for people and for planet. And one exciting thing about this initiative is that the synthesis should underpin the setting of science-based targets for businesses, nations and cities. So the way that's going to be achieved is through a partnership with a body called the Sciencebased Targets Network. There have already been science-based targets put in place for climate. The idea there is that different companies sign up to this science-based target initiative, propose what targets they're going to set for reducing their emissions, and then the science-based target initiative then validates whether that target is good enough or not for the rate of decarbonisation that we need. The Science-Based Targets Network is taking a similar approach, but now for nature. So all the different components of nature on land, in water, and so on and so forth. Some of the key questions that are driving the Earth Commission's work are, first of all, what are the quantitative boundary conditions of a safe and just corridor for the future of people and the planet? So one way in which this is advancing beyond the planetary boundary framework is that it's taking a more explicit integration of biophysical and human dimensions. So, for example, how can both human needs and Earth system stability be incorporated into these boundary conditions? And as I've been elaborating on just now, how can interactions between different components of the Earth system be incorporated? It'll also look at what are the levers of transformation that will help move people and planet into this safe and just corridor, and also what are the challenges of translating this global scale scientific synthesis that the Earth Commission will be doing into science-based targets for local actors. How do you bridge those scales? How do you go from saying we need this certain amount to be achieved at the global scale into assigning responsibilities for individual actors? The Earth Commission has 5 working groups reflecting those 5 goals. Jumei Bai is one of the co-leads of the 5th working group on translation. So just to summarise the entire talk today, I've talked to you about some very recent work that we've been doing designing a prototype Earth system impact metric. This metric incorporates Earth system interactions. It also incorporates regional guardrails. It's based first of all on some modelling using LPJmL, which we then integrated into a feedback model. And I'd be very interested in any comments from any of you here, both on that modelling and analysis, but also some potential links to people who might be interested in using that impact metric down the line. And then I also briefly mentioned the Earth Commission, with which Jumei and I are both involved in. The objective of the Earth Commission is to conduct a global scale assessment of the safe and just corridor for people and the planet. And in a complementary way to this first work that I described, which is about metrics, the Earth Commission, the second goal of the Earth Commission is to underpin the setting of science-based targets for cities and for businesses. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Now I very much welcome any questions or comments that you have.
Any questions, Steve? Jack has a question, so he's online, so you get him up at start.
Okay. Hi, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Jack.
Sure. Well, first of all, congratulations, and yeah, I applaud the effort, because it's often struck me that the whole reliance on just carbon emissions, climate impacts, as you know, sort of some measure of business environmental impacts is far too one-dimensional, and so it's really well worth trying to extend that into just exactly the kind of things you're talking about, to look way beyond just simple carbon emissions. I've got a number of comments and questions, but I'll confine myself to start with to just one, which is, can you explain a bit better how you deal with the different timescales? Because, I mean, for example, if you're dealing with carbon emissions, well, we all know that a lot of the impacts will be only felt decades later when emissions accumulate to affect concentrations. So I get the impression that, you know, the word equilibrium at one point in your slides means that you know, at this level of analysis, you can't really take into account the very different timescales of some of the impacts. Am I right in that understanding?
Yes, that's right. In this current version of the analysis, since we're estimating interactions from LPJ, that involves a cutoff in terms of the, well, no, actually, if we talk in terms of climate feedbacks, we don't have a climate component explicitly in this model. Basically, what we're using in terms of the climate component is a climate sensitivity, which we're building into our feedback analysis. And as we all know, climate sensitivity, that number varies by timescale. We've just chosen a timescale corresponding to impacts this century. And you're completely right that many impacts on climate will play out and have much bigger impacts in subsequent centuries. It's just a choice we have to make for this analysis.
Thanks, Jeff. Were there any other questions from the floor at all?
Can I ask a question? This is May.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I understand. I thought this amplification factor is really a clever way of showing, in a way, a sensitivity from the pressure to state, right? Mm-hmm. So I understand this is probably the global aggregated value. For example, when you say carbon emission amplification factor is 0.76, I was wondering to what extent this is translatable to a smaller scale. As you know, I'm obsessed with translation these days. How do you see this can be translated into a smaller scale, or is it doable at all?
Well, in the case of climate, I presented just one number because we're only measuring climate at the global scale in terms of the global concentration of carbon dioxide. So changes in the amount of CO2 might have regional or local impacts, which then trigger interactions, which then go back to the global scale. For example, climate causing changing vegetation distributions, which then feed back on climate. But the final way that we're defining and measuring climate is at the global scale. For land and water, we do have these regionally aggregated amplification factors. Sorry, the amplification factor is that slide. We do have these regionally aggregated amplification factors. So we have, for example, this number 3.5 for tropical South American forest means that we basically lump all that forest together in one block. That's the scale of our analysis. You could definitely use this method to go to smaller scales as well, or change the way in which you're cutting up the world into these blocks. That would just require, a different analysis, a different measurement of the interactions.
Okay, so if we look at city scale, for example, and look at the grid that you are dealing with, which is 0.5 degree, am I right?
Yes.
So in that sense, when we think about city scale, is it unrealistic to think, this can be translated into that sort of scale? Because 0.5 is almost 50 kilo by 50 kilo, right?
Yeah, it's about 50 kilometre by 50 kilometre.
Yeah.
I think there are newer versions of LPJ which can go a little bit smaller. Mm-hmm. But yes, you're still constrained to splitting it up at a different size. So what I would rather do then, I don't think it's necessary though for LPJ to be able to simulate at the resolution of a specific city. Rather, what we need to be looking at is looking at the pressures that a city has on these different regions. So for example, how much impact does it have on deforestation, both in its vegetation region, but also in others around the world. So I wouldn't necessarily so much be looking at spatially modeling the city itself, but rather we're just looking at where the city's impacts are.
Mm-hmm. So you'll be counting cities more as a sort of source of pressure rather than, the end, which is impact.
Yes, in this analysis, since we're primarily looking at these, at these biophysical interactions, you could, and because we're mainly looking here at also natural vegetation types, you could include, and I think I see where you're going with this, we could include, for example, other types of either crop cover and also other types of human land surface cover, such as cities, which could then be part of this interaction analysis. And then you would need to define this analysis at a small enough scale to cover city land cover as well.
Cool, thank you.
Steve, I have another question.
Is that all right, Pete? Yeah, cool. Yeah, go for it, Jack.
Have you considered the implications of this modeling for questions of data availability and quality? It's just a brainstorm I'm having that, you know, you've given just everything in terms of, in some sense, just a single number without error bars. But I imagine that the quality of the data about types of vegetation, amounts of vegetation, etc., must be very, very different in different parts of the world, you know, particularly presumably quite poor data in poor regions of the world where there's not that much monitoring capacity. Is there any way in which your model will show the different importance of putting extra effort into getting better data in different parts of the world? Because, you know, it's just much more important for these Earth system interactions in some places than in other places, both of which might have similarly poor data.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing to keep in mind is that the interactions analysis that we've done is model-based rather than, and of course those models are parameterized by observations, but our analysis is not directly observation-based, which means it's a little bit hard to interrogate exactly what the uncertainties coming from observations are. We could definitely use, for example, point to these amplification factors as an illustration of which parts of the world are particularly critical, and that we should pay, therefore, more attention to characterizing properly. The other aspect of data quality is then once you start to use this impact metric, and companies then need to assess where their impacts are along their supply chains. That, I would argue, probably has also very large uncertainties with it. Companies are often very uncertain about where all the impacts associated with their supply chains occur. But so we were able to incorporate some interactions, some uncertainty analysis into these interaction strength results. And we will work at including such an analysis into the amplification factor as well.
Okay.
If that's it for questions.
I have yet a third comment.
Yeah, all good by me. Thanks, Jack.
Well, seeing as no one else is crowding the floor, just a pure thought in terms of promotion that, again, it's just a brainstorm that at various points in your presentation, I was thinking, gosh, this is sort of in the same ballpark as the kind of information that comes out of the Global Footprint Network. And just thinking that in terms of trying to get publicity for this, and after all, you're aiming for this exercise ultimately to have an effect on, you know, various agents in the world, on businesses and governments, etc. I just know from my teaching and asking students to hold up their hands and who's heard of ecological footprints and who's heard of World Bank calculations of adjusted net savings, and the answer is chalk and cheese. Everyone's heard of footprint and no one's heard of other measures. That just trying to, you know, add a paragraph or so to a paper that you write on this that tries to make connections with footprint analysis might be a useful promotional device.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Thank you very much, Jack. Definitely a lot of parallels with that kind of analysis.
We have another question from Roger, if you want to speak, Roger.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you. Exceedingly exciting work here, Steve. My own work looks at the reverse arrangement. I work with many people, but including a person called Professor Stefan Schaltegger, who's at the Center for Sustainability Management in Lüneburg, and we look at the business level and try and work upwards to the meso and the macro levels to see what the connections are with sustainability management accounting in particular. And what I like about your approach here is that I find the way you're explaining the situation from the macro to a more disaggregated level ties in exactly with the business thinking, insofar as businesses look at the performance of the organization at a point in time. So they, in their budgeting processes, will make some sort of estimate, and then they'll see how they perform against the estimate, which in a sense, with your amplification factors on the right-hand side of that slide, is what's happening there. They're also looking at the trend over time, and obviously this process you're going through will clearly be very important in terms of the trend over time. So I just wondered if, it's probably too early because this might be the latter part of your work or the next part of research, but whether you wanted to comment at this stage about the thinking processes of businesses, probably cities as well, from a bottom up rather than a top down.
So bottom up in terms of cities taking their own, or businesses taking their own initiative rather than responding to global targets?
Well, it works both ways. Of course, we've got Gilles' work in 2003, which is the bathtub model, which takes it from the macro to the meso and then down to the businesses. But then the transformations occur at the business level, back up to the meso and the macro. And I was just saying that I like the conceptual approach you have here, because you're looking at the situational or contextual setting that businesses have to take on board. Then they have to grapple with this, come up with the appropriate accounting systems, and work through the transformations so that in the end they might, it's very hard to measure, but they might be able to have an impact on the macro variables, the climate change and the water and land issues and so on.
Yeah, so this is one part of both parts of work that I described in this talk. The idea that, first of all, we need action both at the local scale and the global scale. It's not going to be enough to rely on global agreements to get the action that we need. We also need ways to help local actors such as businesses or cities to drive the changes that are needed. So this sort of impact metric could hopefully help them do that. And also the science-based targets that the Earth Commission will help to set should help do that as well. And then at the same time, when we do encourage actors at small scales to take action, we need to make sure that that action is appropriate and of a sufficient scale. So that is also where this cross-scale factor comes in, and what both the science-based part of the science-based targets and this analysis that I've shown you here try to account for. Part of this process will be to help validate and help ensure that the amount of action that is taken is the amount that is needed and is appropriate. And that's the question of translating between those scales. How do you ensure, how do you, in one direction, translate global targets into local targets? And in the other direction, how do you try to make sure local action is compatible with the amount required at the global scale? That issue of translation is something that Jumei and I are working with right now within the Earth Commission. How do you actually do that?
I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that in due course, Steve, and jumping the gun just a little bit here, but clearly we work with a lot of voluntary actions by businesses who perceive what's happening at the more macro level, and then they voluntarily have to gather information. Sometimes it's involving interactions, but frequently it's very focused on individual issues. And they gather the information and they have to work, well, how are they going to transform their businesses into businesses that have products and services that will assist towards, say, carbon emission reduction and so on. So fascinating to see what you're presenting here.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And it's exactly those sorts of actors that we're trying to help with these kinds of metrics and analyses.
Perhaps we can keep in touch. You're at Fenner for how long, actually?
Yeah, well, there are certain restrictions on travel at the moment, which might mean I'm here for quite a while. I'm still currently employed by Stockholm, so I'll probably be going back there for a few months next year, if I can. But then I'm starting, as Jermaine mentioned at the start, a future fellowship at the ANU at Fenner mid-next year, which means I'll be here more or less full time.
Yes, yeah, that's great to hear. Look forward to touching base with you in due course.
Thanks, Roger.
So, is there any more questions? Or?
Yeah, sorry, we have one from the audience here.
Oh, I cannot see.
Stephen, we already have lots of science-based environmental targets which we're failing to achieve. So by developing further targets at an increasingly fine scale, what's the purpose fundamentally if our principal obstacles to progress are, say, political, social and economic?
One motivation is to better connect goals to action. So we can have these goals at the global scale, which, for example, governments can commit to, but we then need to connect those goals to where the action will actually occur. Some of that action needs to be from governments and changes in their regulations, but some of that action needs to be also driven by other actors. So the goal of these metrics and targets is to, in this version, try to help help the leaders in these areas do their jobs better, is the short version. But yeah, good question.
So Steve, I cannot see the floor, but is there any more question?
I think we're good.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve, for this very exciting research presentation. And thank you everyone for joining this, this seminar. So I think it's time for us to close today. Thank you.